The government has decided to declare the 25th of December Good Governance Day because it's Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Madan Mohan Malviya's birthday. But has Mr. Modi forgotten it's also Jesus Christ's birthday? And what gives this government the right to consider Messrs. Vajpayee and Malviya more important than Jesus? Or is this, as some suspect, a calculated affront to Christianity and Christians? That's the discussion in part 2. But first, the revelation that an Indian called Mehdi Masroor Biswas, living in Bengaluru, is the author of the ISIS-supporting Twitter handle Shami Witness, has raised disturbing questions about the involvement of Indian people with ISIS. How deep and wide could this be? What does the government need to do about it? And is there a danger that the VHP and Dharmajagran Manch conversions could exacerbate this potential problem? That's our first discussion tonight. And now joining me to talk about the connection between India and ISIS and how events could make Indian Muslims vulnerable are the former head of RNAW, A.S. Dulat, the executive director of the Institute for Conflict Management, Ajay Sani, the author of Al-Qaeda, The True Story of Radical Islam, and the Guardian South Asia correspondent, Jason Burke, and India's former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates, Zalmiz Ahmed. Mr. Dulat, let's start with Mehdi Masroor Biswas. How serious and worrying is the discovery that the author of Shami Witness is in fact an Indian living in Bengaluru?
You know, Karan, we tend to hype all this up and blow it up a hell of a lot. My own feeling is that I feel sorry for this guy because he seems to have had a perfectly decent job living in Bangalore and seems to have been on some kind of ego trip, gathering or stockpiling all kinds of material and then passing it on as his own. At the worst, you know, he certainly doesn't seem to be a terrorist. At the worst, he may be a virtual jihadi, but what I see it as is net dadagiri.
All right, net dadagiri sounds like a euphemism. It sounds as if you're not very concerned. You don't see this as a worrying development. Have I understood you correctly, Mr. Dulat?
No, no, I'm not saying that it's something that we can just wish away or pass as if nothing has happened. But you know, I mean, the social media itself or connectivity is scary these days.
Okay.
Who would have imagined, let me ask you, yesterday that something like what has happened in Sydney in a cafe could have happened? I mean, it can happen anywhere, anytime.
That's a fair point.
What I'm trying to say is that let's not exaggerate it. I mean, I don't think one Biswas means that there is a connection between the ISIS or Indian Muslims and the ISIS.
Well, that's what I want to try and explore.
I don't think Biswas has any connection.
Ajay Sani, how much did we know of Mehdi Masroor Biswas before Channel 4 revealed his name and location? There are some reports in the papers that suggest that the National Investigation Agency was already on his trail after being tipped off by Arif Majid, although they had no idea of his location and his name. Do you believe that to be the case, or do you think this is a question of people claiming credit where none is really deserved?
You see, we are in no position to find out what the record would have been. But the reality of the situation is that this is essentially an after the event claim. And as you say, they did not know his location. If they had actually been following his Twitters, I think there would have been no difficulty in locating his GPS coordinates and arresting him. Especially in view of the fact that he was carrying out all his tweets and all his activity more or less from the same location.
True. Jason
so I would tend to be a little skeptical about the claim.
Jason Burke, Shami Witness, according to the Times of India, gets as many as 2 million hits a month and is believed to be followed by some 2/3 of all foreign fighters with ISIS. But was this site an aggregator simply translating and tweeting material from a variety of different sources, or do you think Biswas had some measure of direct contact with ISIS and played some sort of role in recruitment as well?
Again, I don't think we can
actually, can I put that to Jason Burke?
authoritatively state that he had.
Can I put that to Jason Burke? Jason Burke, can I put that to you?
Sorry.
Yeah, I don't think we know, and I don't. I'd be very surprised if it was the latter. I'd be very surprised if he was in any kind of direct contact or was any kind of genuine recruiter. If he was a peculiarly incompetent one. I think what's really interesting is looking at the phenomenon of ISIS more generally and at how it has provided a new central focus for Islamic militancy around the world, really. Scattered communities, scattered pockets of radicalism, and scattered individuals, as we've seen this week. That's something that has emerged relatively recently. Remember that Al-Qaeda itself, bin Laden, al-Zawahiri subsequently provided that focus for a long time. That was then missing for several years as Al-Qaeda declined, bin Laden was dead, and it's now back. And that central psychological focus is a very important factor in radicalization and mobilization globally. It allows people to think that they are part of something much bigger than is really the case. And that is a very key factor.
Talmiz Ahmed, let me explore that point and put it like this. The Times of India reports that Arif Majid has revealed that there are more people like Mehdi Masroor Biswas online, and according to the paper, 2 are under watch at the moment. Now, this leads to the question, how widespread is the phenomenon of Indians acting as propagandists, if I can use that word, for ISIS?
I think the Biswas episode brings out 2 or 3 aspects of global jihad. Number 1 is the fact that jihad is today virtual jihad, and that most of the connectivity is through the internet. A large number of young people who are familiar with the instruments of modern communications, of social media, are now engaged in connections of this kind. So very few of them, a very tiny fraction, finally go to the field. But there is a certain allure, there is a romance, there is a sense of participation, there is a sense of involvement. So all of this seems to be coming together. Every context is unique. I want to stress that. We should not look at broad brush approach. So this is the first point. But the second point I want to say is that the Islamic State, albeit very successful, has very limited resonance as far as India is concerned. Indian Muslims tend to be quite aloof from such global happenings. Our concerns tend to be homegrown and domestic, and usually our agitations tend to be limited and usually peaceful. The third point is that Islamic State and Al-Qaeda are quite separate. Indeed, I see them as rivals. Finally, the Islamic State is largely confined to Iraq. Its principal heartland is going to be Iraq. It will attempt to occupy territory in Syria, but that will be largely as part of the agitation against the Bashar regime. As far as I can see, that it will remain engaged with the Iraqi landscape rather than have a global vision or a global spread.
Mr. Dullat, let's explore what you heard Mr. Ahmed call the resonance that ISIS has with Indian Muslims. Now, we know of 4 boys from Kalyan in Maharashtra, which includes Arif Majid, who have gone across and tried to fight with ISIS. We know also 4 or 5 more from Hyderabad who got detained in Calcutta, allegedly en route to Baghdad. But is that it? Or could there be more that we simply don't know about? In other words, how deep and how wide is this resonance?
No, I think Ambassador Talmiz has put it very correctly, that I don't think there's much appeal here among Indian Muslims for ISIS. And if there was anything to fight about, it would be here. You know, we've seen jihad probably at its worst in Kashmir, and even there it is fading now. So I don't think there is appeal for this kind of thing, and people don't unnecessarily want to get themselves involved. The question, I think, which we need to watch out for, and the security services or the intelligence agencies need to keep track of, is that why, where and when does radicalization take place? You know, I mean, we watched this in Kashmir, for instance, that we've all talked about this, in fact, over the years, that radicalization is growing. This is a fact. And people in Srinagar will tell you that one of the breeding grounds there is the Srinagar jail, where stone pelters are kept, where people are repeatedly detained under PSA. And so I think these things need to be looked into. But I don't think there's appeal for ISIS here very much.
But you know, Ajay Sani, the opposite to the view you've heard just now from A.S. Dullat as well a little earlier from Talmiz Ahmed is one that was expressed by the former NSA M.K. Narayanan in September at the IISS in London. He said that perhaps as many as 150 Indians could be involved with ISIS. And he said that most of them would be engineers and that they are not part of what he called the oppressed or the suppressed. They are people who are attracted by what he called the purity of the appeal from ISIS. Do you think that Mr. Narayanan might be correct?
Environment to use that computer and internet capability and do not have the education to exploit these media, such people obviously cannot be part of the recruitment targets.
Okay.
Inevitably, the profile will be educated, will be better educated than it has ever been before, which has its own consequent risks. Better educated people are possibly able to adapt or invent more lethal means of attack at a later stage. But please understand there are also disadvantages to self-motivated terrorists.
I take that.
Earlier on you had a whole Pakistan state-backed enterprise in India where people were trained in bomb making and all, and people talk nonsense about it's very easy to make a bomb off the internet. Kafil Ahmed, the Bristol bomber, was an aeronautical engineer. He rigged 2 car bombs, neither of which went off. So it's not all that easy, and even if the educational profile has improved, I don't think we are going to see any kind of exponential increase in capacities.
Jason Burke, the flip side to what you're hearing is the fact that these are people like Mehdi Masroor Biswas who are self-radicalized on the net, and what happened to him could presumably happen to thousands of other Muslim young men in India. Doesn't this mean that young, disenchanted Muslim men, often very well educated but simply not satisfied with their lot in life, would be very vulnerable to what the net makes accessible so easily and simply?
Yes, in a sense, but I agree with all our fellow panelists this evening who've all said that we shouldn't exaggerate the threat. Ideologies, radical ideologies, violent ideologies have existed obviously for many decades. We're talking about highly educated people being drawn into radical activism or networks. That's what happened with Simi 10 years ago. The Indian Mujahideen started in many ways with components that were very highly educated. If you look at revolutionaries, to use a more or less loaded term, over the centuries, they're always those who have the education to be politicized, to be mobilized, and also to have the organizational and leadership capabilities. So we shouldn't be surprised that it's the more educated people who are becoming involved. My point would be that I differ slightly when people talk about jihad occurring simply in the virtual world. Jihad doesn't just occur in the virtual world at the moment. There were 5,000 people killed in November alone in jihadi violence across the Islamic world. They were not killed in the virtual world. Jihad does become real. Now, what doesn't happen very often is that some guy in a garret, an attic, a room in Bangalore turns into a mass killer. That's something that people worry about a lot, but there are no signs of that happening on any broad scale in India. The threat in India is local primarily and regional secondarily. The global threat, as we've all been pointing out, I think is very much a poor third.
Talmiz Ahmed, in these circumstances, given the vulnerability or not of young Indian men to what they read on the net and the ease with which they can get radicalized and that then be driven, in these circumstances, are the love jihad campaigns that we've seen and now the ghar wapsi or conversion campaigns that we're witnessing literally these days, run by the VHP, the Bajrang Dal and assorted BJP MPs, creating an environment that could push disenchanted Muslim boys further into the clutches of radical Muslim voices, be it ISIS or be it something else? Is this a danger that we are incurring without fully realizing what we're doing?
I think we should distinguish between what is happening at home in India and what is happening in West Asia. What is happening at home in India is a homegrown phenomenon, and it will be addressed within a homegrown discourse. I'm not sure anyone is going to get radicalized overnight and become a jihadi because of these communal episodes that are proliferating in the country. That will be addressed separately, and it will be largely homegrown. It will be a result of dialogue and due process. What you are looking at in terms of the Islamic State or in terms of the Al-Qaeda is a larger phenomenon. It embraces a variety of people, and the impulses are quite different. They have sometimes a national context, they have a regional context, they can even have a personal context. You should recall that it is not a new phenomenon, this allure of violence. It has been with us over the last century. It was first with the anarchists, more recently Bader-Meinhof, the various movements that happened in Japan, and what is happening now in Latin America. There is an allure of violence. In the case of Islam, yes, there is the allure of jihad. It has been with us for 35 years. But the Indian Muslim has kept aloof from jihad. Look at the provocations that we have had in our country in terms of the Kashmir jihad, in terms of Babri Masjid, in terms of riots in different parts of our country. The Indian Muslim has still faith in the Indian constitution. I don't think he is going to become a homegrown jihadi addressing homegrown issues within a domestic context.
I want to put that same question to you, Mr. Duleep, because I think it's a question that's not just driven by the circumstances of today, but is one that probably worries many people when they think, how long will the Indian Muslim remain aloof to jihad if he's being pushed by environment and circumstances in that direction, by love jihad allegations and by conversion campaigns and ghar wapsi campaigns? After all, that does have an impact on the minds of educated young people who anyway are feeling disenchanted and are prone to radical solutions. So is this environment pushing Indian Muslims in the wrong direction even unwittingly?
No, I agree with you that one form of radicalism doesn't neutralize another form, and I don't think we should justify it, neither should we justify any kind of communalism. But at the same time, at this point, I don't think we have too much to worry about, because I don't think the Indian Muslim is inclined towards jihad. And we haven't had Muslims from our country joining the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or even ISIS. So
well, the man who heads, just a moment, the man who heads the new branch of Al-Qaeda set up specifically to target the subcontinent, Asim Umar, is said to be Indian.
See, these are isolated things. I mean, we've been hearing of this for a long time, that, you know, there should be a branch, or there is a branch here. But we haven't seen any evidence of it. And if 3 Muslim boys are picked up, we should not say that this is the Indian branch of Al-Qaeda or whatever it is. I don't think there's anything of the sort here.
Let me put that.
Just exaggerated, and there's a lot of, let me put it like this, there's a lot of wishful thinking from across that this might happen or this could happen. And if Hafiz Saeed says something or wishes something, it doesn't mean it's going to happen here.
Let me put that very quickly to you, Dr. Sani. Do you agree with what you've heard from Mr. Duleep, or do you think there's a certain element perhaps of complacency saying that if 2 or 3 boys get together, you consider it a new group, a new organization or a new chapter of Al-Qaeda, and also that there's an amount of wishful thinking on the Pakistani side that is happening here? Do you agree with that, or do you think he's being a little complacent?
2 things. One, let's go back to something that Asim Omar himself said last year. In an appeal to Indian Muslims, he said, "Why is there no storm in your seas?" So basically the entire jihadi conglomerate based in Pakistan and the global conglomerate simply cannot understand this phenomenon of Indian Muslims so completely ignoring a jihad that seems to be inspiring at least fringe elements all over the world. However, complacency is something that we have to avoid as far as all patterns of terrorism are concerned. Even individuals can do enormous damage. We must remember that according to intelligence estimates, something like 300 Indians have gone across the border, and some of these have also joined the jihad. This is in addition to perhaps thousands of Kashmiris, Indians who had crossed the border much earlier. Some of these groups have attached themselves to Al-Qaeda, others have begun to look towards ISIS for leadership. So I would not be surprised if a few of these fringe of the fringe elements eventually come back and do something in India. And we must remember that with modern technologies, even a single Timothy McVeigh was able to kill 168 people, injure another 680 odd, do millions and millions of dollars of damage. So we can't just sit down and say, well, these are only 3 or 4 people. So we need to be somewhere between complacence and hysteria. We need to be balanced in our approaches and understand there are risks, even if they are only very small numbers. But there is no reason to be completely hysterical in our assessments.
You know, Jason Berg, Indian governments, going back several half decades or full decades, have taken great pride in the fact that Indian Muslims are inured to the call of jihad. But you keep getting evidence that suggests that there are more and more that are getting attracted to it. Do you think the Indian government is a little complacent about this phenomenon, or do you think that the notes that you're hearing from Talmiz Ahmed and Mr. Dulat in particular are the right ones? This is a very containable problem. There's no need to get hysterical, no need to exaggerate at this moment. Where would you come in that division of opinion?
I think I'd probably look elsewhere. I mean, I think the violence, because it poses such an obvious and immediate threat, and is also can be so damaging politically, is often what gets all the attention, gets all the focus, particularly of policymakers. I think what I would be looking at in India is not those who are in a state of radicalization, who have been mobilized, who are preparing violence. And that's a security issue, it's a straight counter-terrorist issue. I think I would be much more focused on the 150 million people who may well not be in the least bit sympathetic towards violence, but who still can understand it or can feel some of the grievances, some of the alienation, some of the anger that pushes a tiny number into violence. That's what I would be looking at. Those are where the big numbers are, not in the very small number of those who are actually becoming active in violence.
Talmiz Ahmed, very quickly, because we're running out of time, if you were asked by the government of India what is the single most important measure they ought to take to ensure that the vulnerability of educated but disenchanted young Muslims to what they learn on the net is reduced, what would your advice be? But you've got to give me a short, sharp answer in 30 seconds.
I think we can agree that there is an increase in the communal discourse in our country. That is a matter of concern. If a view that was on the margins of the Indian political thought is now seeking a space in the center, and it is doing so provocatively in order to make an impact, in order to make a dramatic impact. It is not a concern just for the Indian Muslim. It is a concern for the entire nation. That what is the idea of India that we are committed to? Absolutely. The idea of India has to be accommodative. It has to be multicultural. It has to carry everybody with us. So let us not look at it as a Hindu-Muslim issue. It has to be seen as part of a larger national discourse.
I'm going to have to stop you there. Your words are not just words of wisdom, they're words that actually foreshadow the story we're doing immediately after the break, when we're looking at whether, in fact, it is right for the Indian government to declare Christmas Day, the holiest day in the calendar for Christians, as Good Governance Day, simply because it happens to coincide with Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Madan Mohan Malviya's birthday, ignoring the much bigger, far more important fact that it is Jesus Christ's birthday. Was that a terrible mistake on the part of the Indian government, or was it a calculated affront on Christians and Christianity? That's the story after the break. My thanks to my four guests for joining me, but stick with us.